I came home early to surprise my wife, only to find her sleeping on the doormat like a stray dog. She was wearing torn, filthy rags that I wouldn't even use to clean my car. But that wasn't the part that made my blood turn to ice. The part that froze my soul was watching my son-in-law step out of the house, look down at her, and deliberately wipe the mud from his Italian leather shoes onto the sleeve of her dress. He looked at his guests and laughed, saying, "That is just our crazy maid, ignore her." I didn't scream. I didn't rush forward to punch him in his smiling face. Instead, I took a step back into the shadows and prepared to destroy his entire world. If you have ever been betrayed by the very people you sacrificed everything for, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments which city you are watching from. This is the story of how I taught my ungrateful family that you should never bite the hand that feeds you, especially when that hand still holds the checkbook. My name is Harrison Stone. For 40 years, I built skyscrapers that defined the skylines of Chicago and New York. I was known as the Iron Architect, a man who could see a flaw in a blueprint from a mile away. But as I stood outside the wrought iron gates of my own estate in the Hamptons that Tuesday afternoon, I realized I had missed the biggest structural flaw of my entire life. My family. I had been away for 6 months. A minor stroke had sent me to a private rehabilitation clinic in Zurich. I wanted to recover in peace away from the noise of business, so I left my empire in the hands of my son-in-law, Bradley. I gave him the keys to the kingdom. I gave him power of attorney. I thought I was leaving my legacy in safe hands. I took a taxi from the airport instead of calling the private driver. I wanted to see the look of joy on Beatrice's face when I walked through the door. Beatrice, my wife of 45 years. The woman who had stood by me when I was nothing but a bricklayer with a dream. The taxi dropped me off at the bottom of the driveway. I wanted to walk up the path I had designed myself. I remembered choosing every limestone paver, importing the Japanese maples that lined the drive. This house was my masterpiece, my gift to Beatrice for our golden years. But as I got closer, the serenity I expected was shattered by the thumping bass of electronic music. It was 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Why was there a party? I leaned heavily on my cane, not because I needed to anymore, but because it had become a habit. I moved quietly toward the main portico. The driveway was filled with cars I didn't recognize. Flashy sports cars, convertibles, vehicles that screamed new money and zero taste. My heart started to beat a little faster, a warning rhythm in my chest. Then I saw her. At first I thought it was a pile of old laundry left out by the cleaning staff. A bundle of gray and brown fabric curled up on the expansive welcome mat at the front entrance. I squinted, adjusting my glasses. The bundle moved. It was a person. I stepped closer, staying hidden behind one of the large stone pillars. The figure raised its head. My breath caught in my throat so hard I almost choked. It was Beatrice. But it wasn't the Beatrice I left. My wife was a woman of elegance, a woman who wore silk scarves and smelled of lavender. This woman looked like a refugee from a war zone. Her silver hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was matted and greasy. She was wearing a gray dress that looked like a burlap sack stained with old food and dirt. She was on her hands and knees scrubbing a spot on the stone floor with a rag that looked cleaner than her clothes. "Beatrice," I whispered the word, barely escaping my lips. Before I could move, the heavy oak front doors swung open. Laughter spilled out, loud and obnoxious. Bradley stepped out. He was holding a crystal tumbler of scotch in one hand and a cigar in the other. He looked like the king of the world. And on his feet were the alligator skin loafers I had bought him in Milan for his birthday. $3,000 for a pair of shoes. I remembered how he had hugged me when I gave them to him, tears in his eyes, thanking me for treating him like a son. Bradley stopped right in front of Beatrice. She didn't look up. She shrank back, curling into herself as if expecting a blow. That reaction told me more than 1,000 words ever could. That was not the reaction of a woman who was loved. That was the reaction of a dog that had been beaten too many times. "Excuse me," Bradley said, his voice dripping with arrogance. He didn't step around her. He didn't ask her to move. He lifted his right foot, the one encased in the alligator leather I had paid for, and he dragged the sole across her shoulder. He used my wife as a doormat to clean the mud from his heel. My vision went red. A physical wave of heat surged from my stomach to my brain. My grip on the cane tightened so much I thought the wood would snap. I wanted to rush forward and smash that cane across his teeth. I wanted to tear him apart with my bare hands. I took a step forward, the gravel crunching under my boot. Beatrice looked up at the sound. Her eyes met mine. For a second I saw hope, but then instantly it was replaced by terror. She shook her head frantically, her eyes darting from me to Bradley. Her lips moved silently. "Run." She was mouthing the word run. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid for me. That fear hit me harder than the anger. If I charged in there now, shouting and swinging, what would happen? I was legally an old man recovering from a stroke. Bradley was 35, fit, and surrounded by his cronies. More importantly, he held my power of attorney. If I acted irrational, if I acted violent, he could have me committed. He could claim the stroke had affected my brain. He could lock me away, just like he had clearly locked Beatrice away. I stopped. I forced the red mist to recede. I remembered what my father told me when I was a boy, getting bullied in the schoolyard. If you can't beat them with your fists, Harrison, beat them with your mind. Wait for the moment they blink. I exhaled slowly. I let my shoulders slump. I made my hand tremble visibly. I transformed from a furious husband into a confused, frail old man. I tapped my cane loudly on the stone. "Bradley." I called out, my voice cracking intentionally. "Is that you, son?" Bradley spun around. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a ghost. He dropped his cigar. For a split second, I saw pure panic. He looked at Beatrice, then at me, then back at the guests who were now peering out the door. "Harrison's dad." He stammered. He recovered quickly. I gave him credit for that. He was a sociopath, and sociopaths are excellent actors. He plastered a wide, fake smile on his face and rushed down the steps, carefully stepping over Beatrice as if she were a piece of furniture. "Oh my God, Dad, you're back. Why didn't you call?" "We would have sent the limo," he embraced me. He smelled of expensive scotch and deceit. I forced myself not to recoil. I patted his back feebly. "I wanted to surprise you," I mumbled. Who is that woman on the floor?" "Bradley, is that my bee?" Bradley pulled back his face, assuming a mask of tragic sorrow. He sighed loudly enough for his guests to hear. "Oh, Dad, we didn't want to tell you while you were recovering. We didn't want to hinder your progress. It's Mom. Her mind is gone, Dad. It's early onset Alzheimer's, but very aggressive." He gestured to Beatrice, who was now trembling, her head bowed low. "She refuses to wear normal clothes," Bradley continued, his voice smooth as oil. "She thinks she's a maid. She insists on scrubbing the floors. If we try to stop her, she becomes violent. The doctors said it's best to just let her live out her fantasy. It keeps her calm." I looked at Beatrice. She didn't look up to contradict him. She just scrubbed a non-existent spot on the floor, her tears falling silently onto the stone. "Is that so?" I said, playing the part of the gullible invalid. "My poor bee." "That is our crazy maid," Bradley said to the guests who were watching with curiosity. "My father-in-law has been away. He doesn't know how bad it's gotten. Please, everyone go back inside. The show is over." He put a heavy hand on my shoulder. It felt less like a comfort and more like a restraint. "Come inside, Dad. Let's get you a drink. You look tired. You look old." "I am tired, Bradley," I said, allowing him to guide me up the stairs past my weeping wife. "I am very tired." As I walked past Beatrice, I paused. I looked down at the mud smear on her shoulder. I didn't say a word to her. I couldn't risk breaking character. But in my head, I made a vow. I vowed that for every tear she shed, Bradley would pay with $1,000,000. I vowed that I would strip him of his status, his money, and his freedom. I walked into the house I built into the belly of the beast, knowing that the war had just begun. And I had one advantage he didn't know about. He thought he was dealing with a sheep. He didn't know he had just let the wolf in the front door. The heavy oak doors closed behind us, shutting out the afternoon sunlight and trapping me inside the home I had designed with my own hands. The air inside was cool, conditioned to a perfect 68 degrees, but it felt stagnant. It smelled of expensive cologne and something else, something rotting beneath the surface. As Bradley guided me down the hallway, his grip on my shoulder was firm, almost steering me like a prisoner rather than a guest. I tried to look around, to find comfort in the familiar curves of the archways and the lighting I had spent months perfecting, but my eyes were met with strangers. The hallway, which I had once lined with modest, tasteful impressionist landscapes, collected during my travels with Beatrice, had been stripped bare. In their place hung massive high-definition photographs. There was Bradley shaking hands with a local senator, Bradley standing next to a Ferrari, Bradley holding a trophy at a golf tournament. My home had been turned into a shrine to his ego. I felt a bile rise in my throat. This was not just a renovation. This was an erasure. He had not just moved into my house. He had colonized it. I looked for Emily, my daughter. She was walking ahead of us, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She didn't look back at me. She didn't look at her mother, who was trailing behind us, head bowed, clutching that filthy rag like a security blanket. We entered the dining room. The long mahogany table, a custom piece I commissioned from a master woodworker in Vermont, was set for a feast. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier. Fine china the set Beatrice and I had bought in Paris for our 20th anniversary was laid out at the head of the table. I moved toward my usual seat at the head of the table, a reflex born of 40 years of habit. "Not there, Dad," Bradley said, his voice sickly sweet. He steered me away from the main table toward the corner of the room near the kitchen door. There, set up in the shadows, was a small, flimsy card table. It looked like something you would bring out for a children's party. There was no crystal glass at this setting, no fine china. Instead, there was a bright blue plastic plate and a matching plastic cup, the kind you give to a toddler so they do not hurt themselves. "We don't want you breaking anything by accident," Bradley said, patting my back. "You know how the tremors get. It is for your own safety." I looked at the plastic fork. I looked at the main table where Bradley sat at the head in my chair, looking like a king. Emily sat to his right. I sat in the corner, marginalized in my own empire. But I said nothing. I sat down, my joints popping, and lowered my head as if I accepted this humiliation. "Where is Beatrice sitting?" I asked, my voice trembling just enough to sell the act. Bradley laughed, uncorking a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir. I recognized the label. It was from my private cellar, a bottle I had been saving for my 75th birthday. "Mom doesn't sit at the table." Emily spoke up for the first time. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "She prefers to stand. She likes to help. It makes her feel useful." Beatrice entered from the kitchen. She wasn't holding a plate. She was holding a heavy silver serving tray. It was loaded with roast beef and steaming vegetables. The tray must have weighed 15 pounds. I saw her arms shaking under the strain. She was 70 years old, a woman of delicate constitution, being forced to haul heavy platters like a pack mule. She walked around the table serving the guests. When she reached Emily, my daughter didn't even say thank you. She just tapped her glass, indicating she wanted water, treating her own mother with less courtesy than she would a stranger in a restaurant. Then Beatrice reached Bradley. She moved to pour the wine into his glass. I watched her hands. They were trembling violently, not from age but from fear and exhaustion. I saw her eyes lock onto the wine glass, desperate to aim correctly. The bottle was heavy. She tilted it. For a second, time seemed to slow down. The dark red liquid missed the glass. It splashed onto the white tablecloth, and more importantly, it splashed onto the sleeve of Bradley's white silk shirt. The reaction was instantaneous. There was no gasp of surprise. There was no, "Are you okay?" Bradley stood up so fast, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He swung his backhand without even looking. The sound of the slap was sickening. It was a wet, sharp crack that echoed off the high ceilings. Beatrice didn't cry out. She just crumpled. She fell sideways, hitting the floor hard, the bottle of wine shattering beside her, pooling like blood around her gray dress. "You useless old hag," Bradley roared. "Look at this! This is silk!" I gripped the edge of my plastic table. My knuckles turned white. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to launch myself across the room and wrap my hands around his throat. I wanted to end him. I wanted to tear the life out of him right there in front of his dinner guests. The rage was a physical pain in my chest, a fire so hot it almost blinded me. But I froze. I forced myself to remain seated. I forced my mouth to hang open in a look of senile confusion rather than murderous intent. Beatrice lay on the floor, curling into a ball, shielding her face with her arms, as if expecting a kick. Emily stood up. But she didn't go to her mother. She went to her husband. "Oh God, honey, let me get a napkin," Emily said, dabbing at Bradley's shirt. "I am so sorry. I told her not to handle the wine. She is so clumsy." She turned to her mother, who was weeping silently on the floor. "Mom, look what you did." Emily scolded, her voice dripping with annoyance. "You ruined the dinner. Get up. Clean this mess up right now." Bradley looked over at me, catching my eye. He adjusted his cuffs, composing himself as if he hadn't just assaulted an elderly woman. "You see, Dad," he said, shaking his head with feigned sadness. "The Alzheimer's. It destroys their motor functions. She becomes a danger to herself and everyone else. We have to be strict with her or she forgets her place. It is heartbreaking, really." I looked at him. I looked at the man who was wearing my clothes, drinking my wine, living in my house, and beating my wife. And then I looked at my daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders, the girl I had taught to ride a bike. She was looking at her husband with adoration and at her mother with disgust. In that moment, something inside me broke, but it wasn't my spirit. It was my hesitation. The last shred of mercy I held for my daughter evaporated. I realized this wasn't just Bradley. It was a partnership. They had built their paradise on the bones of our suffering. I stared at the plastic plate in front of me. I let a single tear roll down my cheek. It was a real tear, but not for the reason they thought. I wasn't crying because I was a confused old man. I was crying because I knew what I had to do. I knew that before this week was over, I would have to destroy my own family. "I am so sorry, Bradley," I whispered, my voice raspy. I will talk to her." "Don't bother," Bradley sneered, sitting back down. "She doesn't understand human language anymore. Just eat your mash, Dad, and try not to drool." Beatrice scrambled to her knees, picking up the shards of glass with her bare hands. I saw a drop of blood from her finger mix with the spilled wine. She didn't flinch. She just kept cleaning, terrifyingly efficient, terrified of another blow. I took a bite of the cold mashed potatoes from my plastic plate. It tasted like ash. I chewed slowly, swallowing the food along with my pride. I recorded every detail in my mind. The sound of the slap, the look on Emily's face, the blood on Beatrice's finger. I filed it all away in the folder of my mind labeled evidence. The trial had already begun in my head, and the verdict was already guilty. The sentence would be total annihilation. The house finally fell silent around 3 in the morning. I lay in the darkness of the living room on the stiff sofa they had assigned to me, listening to the settling groans of the timber and steel structure I had designed 20 years ago. I knew every creak of this house. I knew that the third step on the main staircase whispered when you stepped on it, and I knew that the ventilation system hummed a low B-flat note when the heating kicked in. But tonight, the house sounded different. It sounded hostile. Upstairs in the master suite that was rightfully mine, I could hear the faint snoring of my son-in-law, the man who had turned my sanctuary into a prison. I waited another 30 minutes to be absolutely sure. Then I sat up. I left the cane leaning against the sofa. I did not need it. The tremor in my hands vanished as my focus narrowed down to a single objective. I needed to find my wife. They had told me she slept in the guest quarters near the kitchen, the room we used to reserve for the live-in housekeeper back when we entertained senators and CEOs. I moved through the shadows of the hallway, my socks sliding silently on the polished floor. I reached the guest room door and gently turned the handle. It was unlocked. I pushed it open, expecting to see Beatrice curled up on the twin bed. But the room was empty. The bed was made, the sheets perfectly smooth and undisturbed. A layer of dust coated the nightstand. No one had slept in here for weeks. Panic flared in my chest, hot and sharp. If she wasn't here, where was she? Had they put her in the garage? The garden shed, then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic clinking sound coming from beneath the floorboards. It was a metallic sound, like iron striking stone. I froze. The sound was coming from the ventilation grate near the floor. It was coming from the wine cellar. My blood ran cold. I had built that wine cellar as a celebration of my success. It was a climate-controlled vault where I kept bottles of Bordeaux worth more than most cars. It was meant to be a place of refinement, a place where I would sit with Beatrice and toast to our grandchildren. I moved toward the basement door. It was locked from the outside with a heavy-duty deadbolt that hadn't been part of my original design. Bradley must have installed it. He thought a lock would stop me. He forgot that I was the one who drew the blueprints. I knew there was a secondary maintenance access panel behind the pantry shelving intended for servicing the cooling unit. It was a tight squeeze, but rage made me slicker. I pushed aside the heavy shelves of dry pasta and canned goods, found the hidden latch, and slipped into the narrow service corridor. The air in the cellar was freezing. I had set the system to keep the wine at 55 degrees, but it felt much colder now. The smell hit me first. It wasn't the rich aroma of oak and aging grapes. It was the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. I rounded the corner past the rows of dusty bottles and saw her. Beatrice was not sitting on a chair. She was sitting on the cold concrete floor, huddled in the corner where I used to keep the tasting table. And she was chained. I had to cover my mouth to stop a scream from tearing out of my throat. A heavy rusted iron chain was looped around her left ankle. The other end was padlocked to the steel support beam of the wine rack. It was a chain meant for a large dog. The metal had rubbed the skin of her ankle raw, leaving angry red welts and dried blood. My wife, the woman who had chaired charity galas and raised our children with infinite grace, was tethered like an animal in the basement of her own home. I rushed forward, no longer caring about the noise. "B," I whispered, harsh and urgent. She flinched violently, scrambling backward until the chain pulled taut with a sickening clank. She threw her hands up to cover her face. "No, no, I will be quiet," she whimpered, her voice thin and broken. "I promise, Bradley. I won't make noise. Don't hit me. Please, I am cold." Her words were like daggers being driven into my heart. She didn't even look at me. She just assumed I was her tormentor coming for another round. "B." "Look at me," I said, my voice cracking. "It is Harrison. It is me." She lowered her hands slowly. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and terrified. In the dim light of the cellar's emergency bulb, she looked like a ghost. She squinted, her mind struggling to process reality through the fog of trauma and whatever drugs they had forced into her system. "Harrison," she breathed. You are real." I dropped to my knees on the hard concrete and pulled her into my arms. She was so thin. I could feel every rib through the rough fabric of that maid's dress. She smelled of old sweat and mildew, but to me she was the most precious thing in the world. She collapsed against my chest, her body shaking with silent sobs. "I thought you were dead," she whispered into my shirt. "They told me you died in Switzerland. They said I was confused. They said I killed you." I pulled back, gripping her shoulders. My hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, murderous intent. "I am alive, B. I am right here. Listen to me. Why are you down here? Why are they doing this?" She looked toward the door, her eyes darting nervously. "The papers," she gasped, clutching my arm. "The trust fund, Harrison. The one you set up for the grandkids. Bradley wants control of it. He says he needs the signature. I told him no. I told him you would never allow it." She took a ragged breath, clutching her chest. "My heart," she whispered. "It hurts." "They took my pills, Harrison. They said the medicine was too expensive. They gave me blue pills instead. They make my head spin. I can't think. I can't remember the days. It wasn't Alzheimer's. It was torture. They were deliberately withholding her heart medication to weaken her, to induce a state of confusion and pain so she would sign over the last of our assets. They were slowly killing her and calling it natural causes. I looked down at the chain around her ankle. The padlock was a cheap model, probably bought at a hardware store. I reached into my pocket. I didn't have a key, but I had a small multi-tool I always carried, a habit from my days on construction sites. I unfolded the thin metal pick. "Hold still," I whispered. I worked the lock. My vision blurred with tears of rage, but my hands remembered the movements. Click. The lock sprang open. I unwound the heavy chain from her leg. Beatrice sighed, a sound of pure relief as the weight was lifted. I rubbed her ankle, trying to bring circulation back to the cold, bruised skin. "Take me away," she begged, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Please, Harrison. Take me upstairs. Call the police. Let's go." I looked at the open door of the cellar. I looked at the fragile woman in my arms. If I took her upstairs now, what would happen? Bradley would wake up. He would call the police and say I was having a dementia episode, that I had broken into the cellar and was kidnapping his senile mother-in-law. He had the medical papers. He had the legal power. I had nothing but a cane and a story no one would believe yet. We would lose. He would put her in a state facility, and I would never see her again. I had to make the hardest decision of my life. To save her, I had to hurt her one last time. "B, listen to me," I said, bringing my face close to hers. "I cannot take you yet." Her face crumpled, despair washing over her features. "No, please don't leave me," she sobbed. "I need 24 hours. I said, my voice fierce and low. "Just 24 hours. I need to get the evidence. If I take you now, they win. They will separate us forever. Do you understand? I am going to destroy them, B. I am going to make them pay for every second you spent in this dark room. But you have to be brave for one more day." She looked at me, searching my eyes. She saw the man she had married 40 years ago. She saw the iron architect. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I trust you." I picked up the chain. It felt like I was picking up a burning coal. My soul screamed at me to throw it away, to carry her out of there. But I forced myself to wrap the cold metal back around her bruised ankle. I forced myself to click the padlock shut. The sound of that lock clicking shut was the sound of my heart breaking. It was also the sound of a death warrant for Bradley and Emily. I kissed her forehead. I left her a bottle of water I had brought from the kitchen and hid it behind a crate where they wouldn't see. I will come back for you, I promised. And when I do, this house will belong to us again. I left the cellar, locking the door behind me. I climbed back through the maintenance shaft, back into the silence of the lie I was living. I lay down on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. I did not sleep. I spent the rest of the night planning the funeral of my son-in-law's career, his reputation, and his freedom. He had chained my wife to a rock. Tomorrow I would bring down the mountain on top of him. The sun streamed through the living room windows at 6 in the morning, blinding and cheerful, a stark contrast to the darkness of the night before. I had not slept. I had spent every hour staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the role I was about to play. It was the role of a lifetime, and the reviews would be written in court documents. To save Beatrice, I had to cease being Harrison Stone, the architect, the visionary, the man of steel. I had to become something pitiful. I had to become a burden. I heard footsteps upstairs. Bradley and Emily were waking up. This was it. I sat up on the sofa, my joints stiff from the uncomfortable cushions. I looked down at my trousers. They were gray wool slacks, expensive tailored. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes, summoning every ounce of willpower I possessed. I thought about Beatrice chained in the cellar. I thought about the bruise on her face. And then I let go. I forced my bladder to release. The sensation was warm and humiliating. It spread down my legs, soaking into the fabric, pooling on the expensive Persian rug beneath my feet. I sat there, feeling the dampness turn cold, feeling the sharp sting of shame rising in my throat. I was 70 years old. I had built skyscrapers. I had shaken hands with presidents. And now I was sitting in my own urine in my own living room. But as the shame washed over me, I grabbed onto it. I used it. I let it slacken my jaw. I let it gloss over my eyes. I wasn't Harrison anymore. I was a leaking vessel, a problem to be solved. Emily came down the stairs first, dressed in a silk robe, scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up until she was 5 feet away. When she did, she stopped dead. Her nose wrinkled. "Oh my God," she said, her voice rising in a screech. "Bradley! Bradley, come down here right now!" I looked at her, blinking slowly, keeping my mouth slightly open. I plucked at the wet fabric of my trousers, as if I didn't quite understand what it was. "It is warm," I mumbled, slurring the words. Emily Water Bradley came thundering down the stairs, buttoning his dress shirt. He looked annoyed at being summoned. "What is it now? I have a conference call in 20 minutes, Emily." "Look," Emily pointed at me, her fingers shaking with disgust. "Look at him. He wet himself. He peed right on the antique rug." Bradley looked at me. He looked at the dark stains spreading on the sofa. He didn't look concerned. He looked relieved. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, isn't that just perfect?" he chuckled, walking over to inspect me like I was a broken appliance. "I told you his brain was mush, Em. The plumbing is going too." He leaned down, his face inches from mine. The smell of his peppermint mouthwash was overpowering. "Did you have a little accident, Dad?" he asked, speaking loudly and slowly as if I were deaf. "Did you forget where the potty is?" I stared past him, focusing on a dust mote floating in the sunlight. I let my head loll to the side. I don't know," I whispered. Great Bradley straightened up, clapping his hands together. "Just great. Now we have 2 toddlers in the house. One in the basement and one in the living room. Call the cleaning service, Emily, and get him some diapers. I am not dealing with this. They didn't even help me up. They left me sitting there in my filth while Emily made a phone call to the maid service and Bradley went into the kitchen to make coffee. I sat there for 20 minutes, shivering, humiliated, but triumphant. They had bought it. They had bought it completely. To them, I was no longer a threat. I was furniture. I was a stain. And because I was nothing, I became invisible. Bradley came back into the living room with a mug of coffee and his phone pressed to his ear. He didn't even look at me. He paced back and forth in front of the sofa, talking loudly, assuming the wet, senile old man in the corner couldn't comprehend a word he was saying. "Yes, Mike. I know the buy-in is high," he said into the phone, his voice vibrating with excitement. "That is why I need this to happen fast. No, don't worry about the liquidity. I have it covered. The old man is basically a vegetable. I am looking at him right now. He just pissed himself, Mike. Literally. He is gone." I sat very still. Mike. That would be Michael Sterling, a low-level broker I had fired 5 years ago for unethical practices. If Bradley was dealing with him, this was worse than I thought. Bradley paused, listening to the other end. He took a sip of coffee, pacing nervously. "Yeah, the papers are ready. I am getting his thumbprint on the power of attorney transfer tonight. Once that clears, I get access to the main trust. That is 10 million liquid. I can wire it to the crypto exchange by Friday." Crypto exchange. My ears pricked up, though my face remained blank. I knew the market. I knew the trends. But the way Bradley was talking about it, the urgency, the promise of immediate returns, it didn't sound like an investment. It sounded like a gamble. "Look, Mike," Bradley continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You promised me 300% return in the first month. I need that. I am leveraged up to my eyeballs on this house. If this coin launches and dumps, I am dead. You said this was a sure thing." I almost smiled. Almost. A sure thing. In my 40 years of business, I had learned one universal truth. If someone promises you a 300% return in a month, they are not selling you an investment. They are selling you a rope to hang yourself with. Bradley wasn't just investing in crypto. He was buying into a pump and dump scheme. He was the mark. He was the sucker at the poker table who didn't know he was the sucker. He was planning to take the $10 million I had saved for my grandchildren's college funds for Beatrice's care for our legacy and throw it into a digital fire pit. He was going to wipe us out. He was going to leave Beatrice destitute. "Yeah, I got it," Bradley said, laughing nervously. 10 million and 30 million out. "We will be kings, Mike. I will buy the old man a golden wheelchair. All right? I have to go. I have to get him cleaned up before the lawyer comes. Bye." He hung up the phone and looked at me. The disgust was back in his eyes, but it was mixed with a terrifying hunger. He didn't see a father-in-law. He saw a piggy bank he was about to smash open. "You hear that, Dad?" he said, walking over and patting my cheek a little too hard. "You are going to make me very rich, again. And you won't even know it happened." Emily walked in with a pile of towels and a pair of oversized sweatpants. She looked tired. She looked defeated. But she didn't look innocent. She knew what he was doing. She was letting it happen because she liked the silk robes and the country club memberships more than she loved her parents. "Clean him up," Bradley ordered, checking his Rolex. "I have to go to the office. Make sure he is presentable for tonight. And don't give him too much water. I don't want another puddle when he is signing the check." He walked out the front door whistling. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing his fate. He thought he had just secured his fortune. He didn't know he had just given me the weapon I needed to execute him. Emily threw the towels at me. They landed on my chest. "Clean yourself up, Dad," she muttered, not making eye contact. "I will be in the kitchen." I waited until she left the room. Then I slowly wiped my face with the towel. I wasn't just wiping away sweat. I was wiping away the last trace of doubt. Bradley wasn't just cruel. He was stupid. And stupidity in the world of high finance was a capital offense. He had just confessed to wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes, all within earshot of the primary witness. I looked down at the wet stain on the rug. It was disgusting. It was vile. But it was also the smartest thing I had ever done. Because while they were looking at the mess, they stopped looking at the man. And the man was busy sharpening his knife. I stood up, my legs steady, my mind clear. I had 12 hours until the signing ceremony. 12 hours to turn his trap into his tomb. The toddler was about to teach the master a lesson in gravity. What goes up on a bubble of lies must come down hard. And I would be there to ensure he hit every rock on the way to the bottom. The roar of Bradley's Jaguar F-Type faded down the driveway, followed 10 minutes later by the lighter hum of Emily's Mercedes. She was heading to a day spa in the city, a reward she felt she deserved for tolerating her incontinent father for 24 hours. The moment the electronic gate clicked shut, the silence of the house wrapped around me. It was not a lonely silence anymore. It was the silence of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. I stood up from the sofa. The tremors in my hands vanished instantly. The hunch in my back straightened until I stood at my full height of 6 feet. I walked to the window and watched the dust settle on the driveway. They were gone. They thought they had left a helpless old man and a broken woman in their wake. They had no idea they had left the fox alone in the henhouse. I moved quickly toward the west wing of the house. This area was supposed to be my sanctuary. It was where I had designed the skylines of 3 major cities. The double doors to my study were closed. I turned the handle. Locked. Of course. Bradley had claimed this room the day after I left for Switzerland. He called it his command center. I called it a desecration. I didn't bother looking for a key. I didn't need one. When I built this house, I installed a friction hinge on the top of the doorframe for emergencies. I reached up, applied pressure to the specific spot in the molding that looked like a decorative knot of wood, and the door clicked. It swung open silently. The smell hit me first. It used to smell of old paper mahogany and the faint scent of my pipe tobacco. Now it reeked of stale cigars and cheap body spray. I stepped inside and felt a wave of nausea. My drafting table, a vintage piece from the 1920s, was pushed into a corner, piled high with unopened mail. In its place stood a glass and chrome monstrosity of a desk, covered in monitors displaying fluctuating graphs of cryptocurrencies. I walked behind the desk. I wasn't here to critique his interior design choices. I was here for the wall safe. I pushed aside the high-back leather executive chair and looked at the wall behind the desk. There it was, hidden behind a large oil painting. Ironically, he had kept the painting I chose. It was a moody seascape, a ship battling a storm. Bradley probably thought it looked powerful. He didn't know I had chosen it because the ship was sinking. I swung the painting aside on its hinges. The safe face was revealed. It was a modern digital model with a biometric scanner and a keypad. Bradley had obviously installed it recently, thinking it was impenetrable. I could imagine him smirking as he programmed the code, thinking he was the smartest man in the room. He was a fool. He had mounted the new digital safe face over the existing steel frame I had embedded into the foundation of the house. He didn't know that the locking bolts were still connected to the original mechanical override I had designed 20 years ago. I didn't trust electronics. Batteries die. Circuits fail. But gravity and leverage never fail. I reached to the side of the safe, to the wooden paneling that lined the wall. To the naked eye, it was just a seamless piece of oak. But my fingers found the slight imperfection in the grain, the one I had placed there on purpose. I pressed down hard with my thumb and slid the panel upwards by a fraction of an inch. A soft metallic click resonated from inside the wall. The failsafe was engaged. The locking bolts retracted with a heavy thud. I pulled the handle. The heavy steel door swung open. I didn't smile. There was no joy in this victory, only a grim satisfaction. I reached into the dark metal box and pulled out a stack of documents. The first file was a thick manila folder labeled Beatrice, Medical. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, not from age but from rage. Inside were documents on the letterhead of a Dr. Aris Thorne. I scanned the pages. Patient exhibits severe cognitive decline, violent outbursts. Recommendation: permanent institutionalization. I flipped to the back of the file, and there it was, the smoking gun. It wasn't a medical chart. It was an invoice. Consult fee, $50,000. Payment method: cash. Bradley hadn't just exaggerated Beatrice's condition. He had bought it. He had paid a crooked doctor $50,000 to write a false diagnosis that would strip my wife of her rights and dignity. He had purchased her insanity. I felt a growl rising in my throat, a primal sound of fury. I wanted to tear the paper to shreds, but I stopped myself. Destroying it would solve nothing. I needed to preserve it. I set the medical file aside and reached for the next pile. These were different. They were messy, crumpled papers with red stamps on them. I unfolded the top one. It was a final notice from a bank I had never heard of in the Cayman Islands. Outstanding balance, $4.2 million. I picked up the next one. It was handwritten on a piece of notebook paper, but the message was more official than any bank letter. Bradley, you are out of time. The interest is now 10% a week. Pay up or we start taking fingers. I stared at the paper. It all made sense now. The desperation, the rush to get my signature, the cheap clothes Beatrice was wearing. Bradley wasn't just a greedy climber. He was a drowning man. He had gambled everything on high-risk schemes and lost. He was millions of dollars in debt to people who didn't send lawyers. They sent hitmen. He needed my $10 million not to get rich, but to stay alive. He was planning to throw my life savings into a black hole of debt, leaving me and Beatrice destitute on the street, while he tried to save his own skin. I reached for my cane. It was an old piece of hickory wood, battered and scratched. Bradley had looked at it with disdain earlier. He didn't know that inside the hollowed-out handle was the latest technology. I twisted the handle and pulled. The top of the cane slid up, revealing a high-resolution camera lens embedded in the wood. It was a spy gadget Marcus had given me, a toy for a paranoid old man, he had joked. Now it was a weapon. I lined up the documents on the desk. Click. The invoice from the corrupt doctor. Click. The threat from the loan shark. Click. The bank statements showing the embezzlement of company funds to pay for online gambling. I photographed every page. I photographed the safe itself. I photographed the stash of blue pills I found in the back of the safe, the ones he was using to drug Beatrice. Once I had everything, I carefully placed the papers back exactly as I had found them. I matched the edges of the folders. I made sure the dust patterns were undisturbed. I closed the heavy steel door. I slid the wooden panel back down until it clicked. I swung the painting back into place. I stepped back. The room looked untouched. The crime scene was pristine. I walked out of the office and locked the door using the friction hinge. As I walked back to the living room, I checked the upload status on my phone hidden in the cane. Upload complete. Sent to Marcus. I sat back down on the urine-stained sofa. I picked up the towel Emily had thrown at me and draped it over my lap. I slumped my shoulders. I let my jaw go slack. Harrison Stone was gone. The senile old man was back, but inside the fire was burning brighter than ever. I had the evidence. I had the motive. I had the weapon. Tonight at the signing ceremony, Bradley thought he was going to receive a kingdom. Instead, he was going to receive an execution. And the best part was, he had dug his own grave. All I had to do was push him in. The kitchen was a gleaming expanse of marble and stainless steel, a cold and sterile laboratory where my daughter and her husband concocted their daily lies. I stood there leaning heavily on my cane, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The house was empty, but the ghosts of their cruelty hung in the air. I made my way to the dedicated medicine cabinet above the espresso machine. This was where Emily kept her arsenal of beauty supplements, sleep aids, and anxiety blockers. It was also where they kept the leash they used to control my wife. I found the bottle on the second shelf pushed to the back behind a large jar of protein powder. It was an amber glass jar with a generic label that read Senior Vitality Complex. Below that, in smaller font, it promised memory support and cognitive health. It was a sick joke. They were feeding her poison and labeling it as a cure. I took the bottle down the glass, cool against my palm. Inside rattled the sound of their betrayal. I unscrewed the cap. Inside were dozens of bright blue gelatin capsules. They looked harmless. They looked like candy. But I knew better. I poured one into my hand. It was light, innocent looking. I glanced around the kitchen to ensure I was truly alone. Then I carefully pulled the two halves of the capsule apart. It came open with a soft pop. A fine white powder spilled into my palm. I raised my hand to my face. There was no smell, not really. Maybe a faint, dusty chemical scent. I hesitated. I was not a chemist, but I was a man who had built hospitals. I knew enough about materials to know that harmless vitamins usually had a distinct earthy odor. This was void. I wetted the tip of my pinky finger and pressed it into the pile of powder, then touched it to the tip of my tongue. The taste was instant and vile. It wasn't sour like vitamin C. It was bitter, a dry, metallic bitterness that seemed to suck the moisture right out of my mouth. It numbed the tip of my tongue almost immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew this taste. I had read about it in a security briefing years ago when I was designing a high-security compound in South America. It was scopolamine, the devil's breath. It was a drug derived from the borrachero tree used by criminals to render victims docile, suggestible, and unable to form memories. It turned people into zombies who would empty their bank accounts or open their safes with a smile, then wake up remembering nothing. The rage that filled me then was different from the anger I had felt before. Before, I was angry at their greed. I was angry at their disrespect. But this was different. This was not theft. This was murder. They were murdering my wife's mind. They were systematically deleting her personality day by day, pill by pill, so they could use her empty shell to sign checks. They were keeping her in a twilight state of compliance, erasing the woman I loved and replacing her with a puppet. I gripped the edge of the granite counter. My knuckles turned white. I wanted to smash the bottle against the wall. I wanted to burn this house to the ground with them inside. But fire destroys evidence, and I needed this evidence. I needed every single grain of this powder to bury them. I took a deep breath, forcing the red mist to recede. I had to think like an architect. I had a structural problem, and I needed a structural solution. If I took the pills away, Beatrice would go into withdrawal or wake up too fast and they would notice. They would find another way to hurt her. I needed her to wake up, but I needed them to believe she was still asleep. I looked around the kitchen. My eyes landed on the pantry. I walked over and opened the door. There on the second shelf was a bag of confectioner's sugar, powdered sugar, white, fine, and identical in texture to the poison in my hand. I moved quickly. I cleared a space on the counter and laid out a sheet of baking paper. I emptied the blue capsules one by one. It was tedious work. Twist, pull, dump, twist, pull, dump. A small mountain of the toxic white powder grew on the paper. I worked with the precision of a surgeon, my large hands moving with a delicacy that belied my fury. Once the capsules were empty, I carefully folded the paper containing the scopolamine and poured it into a small Ziploc bag I found in a drawer. I squeezed the air out, sealed it, and slipped it into my pocket. This was going to the police lab along with the photos from the safe. Now came the restoration. I opened the bag of powdered sugar. I poured a small amount onto a fresh sheet of paper. Using the tip of a steak knife, I began to refill the blue capsules. It was a slow process. I had to make sure the weight felt right. I had to make sure no sugar spilled on the outside. As I filled each capsule, I thought about what I was doing. I was replacing bitterness with sweetness. I was replacing slavery with freedom. Every grain of sugar I put into these plastic shells was a step back toward reality for Beatrice. Tonight, when they forced this down her throat, they would expect her to fade away. Instead, she would receive a rush of energy. Her mind would start to clear. The fog would lift. I capped the last pill. I wiped the counter down 3 times to ensure no trace of the sugar or the drug remained. I put the blue capsules back into the amber bottle and screwed the lid on tight. I gave it a shake. It rattled just the same. I placed the bottle back on the shelf behind the protein powder, exactly where I had found it. I stood back and looked at the scene. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. The weapon they used against us had been neutralized. Tonight, Beatrice would wake up, and when she did, she would remember. She would remember the abuse. She would remember the fear. And most importantly, she would remember who she was. She was Beatrice Stone, the wife of the Iron Architect, and she was not a woman to be trifled with. I checked my watch. I had been working for 40 minutes. They would be back soon. I needed to get back to the sofa. I needed to put my mask back on. But as I walked out of the kitchen, I felt lighter. The heaviness in my chest had lessened. I had just performed an exorcism in my own kitchen. I had cast out the devil's breath and replaced it with a simple, sweet truth. I sat back down in the living room, arranging the towel over my legs. I closed my eyes and waited. I imagined the look on Bradley's face when Beatrice looked him in the eye without fear. I imagined the terror he would feel when he realized his voodoo doll had cut its own strings. The clock was ticking, Bradley, and you just lost your most powerful weapon. You just lost your control. And a man like you without control is nothing but a frightened child. I sat there in the silence, waiting for the sound of the Jaguar engine smiling internally. The sugar was in the pill. The trap was primed. Let the game begin. I told the cleaning lady I was going to the park to feed the ducks. It was the kind of aimless, harmless activity a senile old man would do, and she didn't even look up from her phone as she waved me out the door. The moment I stepped past the iron gates of the estate, the transformation began. I walked for 2 blocks, leaning heavily on my cane, dragging my left foot just in case anyone was watching from a window. But as soon as I turned the corner onto the tree-lined path of Elmwood Park, the limp vanished. I straightened my spine. I adjusted my collar. The confused geriatric evaporated, and the CEO returned. The air was crisp and clean, a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere of my own home. I breathed it in deeply, clearing the phantom scent of urine and betrayal from my nostrils. I checked my watch. Marcus was never late. In 30 years of handling my legal affairs and covering my back in boardroom wars, Marcus had never been a minute late. I saw him sitting on a bench near the fountain, a newspaper folded in his lap, looking like any other retiree enjoying the afternoon sun. But I knew better. Marcus was a shark in a cardigan. He saw me approaching and stood up, his eyes scanning my face, looking for the damage. "You look like hell, Harrison," he said, his voice gruff with worry as he gripped my hand. "I feel worse," I replied, sitting down next to him. But the upload worked. "You got the photos?" Marcus nodded, his expression hardening. He pulled a tablet from his leather satchel and placed it between us. "I got them. And combined with what my forensic accountants dug up this morning, it is a bloodbath, Harrison. Your son-in-law isn't just a gambler. He is a thief, and a sloppy one at that." He tapped the screen, bringing up a series of digital documents. I leaned in, my eyes narrowing. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a scanned check. "This is a withdrawal from the company's operational reserve fund. $2 million authorized last Thursday. And look at the signature." I looked. It was my signature. It was a perfect forgery, the loops of the H and the sharp cross of the T, exactly how I had signed them for decades. He practiced, I muttered, a cold anger settling in my gut. He sat in my office, used my pens, and practiced signing my name while I was recovering from a stroke. "He didn't just practice," Marcus said. "He used a digital tracer. We found the IP logs. He scanned an old contract and used a heavy-duty printer to replicate the ink pressure. It is fraud, Harrison. Class A felony. But that is not the worst part. He swiped to the next screen. It was an internal memo from the Federal Regulatory Board. The auditors are coming on Monday, Marcus whispered. That is why he is panicked. That is why he is pushing for the trust fund transfer tonight. He needs to replace that $2 million before the auditors open the books on Monday morning. If that money isn't back in the account, he goes to federal prison for 15 years. I sat back, absorbing the information. It all fit. The urgency, the violence, the desperation. Bradley wasn't just trying to get rich. He was trying to stay out of a cage. He was cornered. And a cornered rat bites. So Marcus said, closing the tablet cover with a snap. I have the police commissioner on speed dial. I have the evidence of the forgery, the elder abuse, the drugging. We can have a SWAT team at your door in 20 minutes. We take him down now. We save Beatrice. We end this. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. No, I said. Marcus froze. He looked at me as if I had lost my mind for real. Harrison, did you hear me? He is dangerous. He hit Beatrice. If we leave you in there, if we arrest him now. I interrupted, my voice low and steady. He will lawyer up. He will claim he was managing the funds for me because of my mental state. He will say the signature was authorized verbally. He will drag this out in court for 5 years. He will drag Beatrice's name through the mud. He will claim she is incompetent. And worst of all, he will still think he is smart. He will think he just got unlucky. I looked at the fountain, watching the water rise and fall. I don't just want him arrested, Marcus. I want him broken. I want him to believe he has won everything. I want him to stand on the top of the mountain, look down at the world he thinks he owns, and then I want to be the one to push him off. Marcus lowered his phone. He knew that look in my eyes. He had seen it before when we hostilely took over a rival firm that had tried to bankrupt us in the 90s. What do you want me to do? He asked. I want you to prepare the transfer papers, I said. Fake ones, no, I replied. Real ones. Marcus's jaw dropped. Real ones, you are going to sign over $10 million to him. I am going to sign over the control of the trust, I explained, leaning closer. But I want you to add a clause, a poison pill. Buried in the subtext of page 42 in the definitions section. Make the transfer of authority conditional upon the beneficiary having 0 outstanding criminal investigations or civil liabilities at the exact moment of signing. Marcus smiled, a slow, sharp smile that matched my own. Since he already committed the forgery last week, he is already liable, Marcus said, catching on. Exactly. The moment he signs that document accepting the funds, he is legally acknowledging his status. And because the condition isn't met, the funds don't actually transfer. It looks like they do. The banking app will show the pending balance. But the money will never clear. He will think he is rich. He will wire the money to the crypto scammers. And when the transfer bounces 48 hours later, he will be in debt to the loan sharks under arrest by the feds and broke. It is ruthless, Harrison, Marcus said, shaking his head in admiration. It is completely ruthless. He hurt my wife, Marcus, I said, standing up. He chained her in a basement. Ruthless is a kindness compared to what I want to do to him. I adjusted my coat. Bring the papers tonight. Play the part of the reluctant lawyer. Act like you hate doing it. Make him feel like he beat you too. I will be there at 7, Marcus promised. Be careful, old friend. You are walking back into the lion's den. I picked up my cane and hunched my shoulders, letting the year-saws crash back down on me. He is not a lion, Marcus. He is a hyena, and hyenas only laugh until the lion wakes up. I turned and walked back toward the house. I walked slowly, shuffling my feet, practicing my tremble. I stopped at a vendor and bought a bag of stale breadcrumbs, scattering them on the ground so I would smell like birds. Every step took me closer to the final act. I felt a strange calm settling over me. The plan was set. The trap was dug. All that was left was to put the bait on the hook and watch him swallow it whole. I walked through the gates of my estate, the enemy territory, and saw Bradley's car in the driveway. He was back. Good. I hoped he was celebrating. I hoped he was opening champagne, because the hangover I was about to give him would last for the rest of his miserable life. Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, the silence broken only by the scraping of silverware on china. I sat at my small card table in the corner, staring down at a bowl of lukewarm broth they had served me. It was clear they were doing the bare minimum to keep me alive until the ink on the papers was dry. Beatrice stood by the sideboard, her head bowed, waiting for permission to clear the plates. I watched her closely. There was a subtle change in her posture. She wasn't slouching as much as she had been yesterday. Her hands resting on the serving tray were still trembling, but the chaotic, jerky movements caused by the drugs were dampening. The sugar placebo was working. Her body was beginning to detox, but she was smart enough to keep her eyes lowered, playing the part of the broken doll just as I was playing the part of the broken old man. I decided it was time to drop the hammer. I let my spoon clatter loudly into the bowl, splashing broth onto the plastic placemat. Bradley looked up from his steak annoyance flashing across his face before he masked it with a sigh of exaggerated patience. "Careful, Dad," he said, popping a piece of filet mignon into his mouth. "We don't want another mess like this morning, do we?" I didn't answer immediately. I let my head hang low, my chin resting on my chest. I took a ragged, wheezing breath, the kind that rattles deep in the lungs. It was a sound I had practiced in the mirror, the sound of a man whose engine is running on fumes. "Bradley," I rasped, my voice barely audible. He stopped chewing. He exchanged a glance with Emily. "What is it?" "Do you need to go to the bathroom?" "No," I whispered. "I need to talk. I have been thinking all day. About what you said. About the 2 toddlers in the house." Bradley put his knife down. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was trying to gauge if I was having a lucid moment or a senile ramble. "I know I am a burden." I continued, forcing a tear to pool in the corner of my eye. "I know my mind is going. The doctor in Zurich, he told me. He said it is vascular dementia. He said I have maybe 6 months before the lights go out completely." I paused, letting the lie hang in the air. I saw Emily's hand go to her mouth, not in sorrow, but in shock. Bradley, however, didn't look shocked. He looked calculated. He leaned forward, his interest piqued. "6 months, he asked, his voice steady. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I nodded weakly. And today made me realize he was right. I can't control my body. I can't control my thoughts. And I certainly can't control a multinational corporation. I looked up, meeting his eyes. I let my gaze be pleading, desperate. "I am scared, Bradley. I am scared of losing everything I built. The company, the properties, the legacy. If I die without a clear successor, the board of directors will tear it apart. They will sell it off, piece by piece." Bradley was listening now. He was leaning so far forward, his chest was almost touching his plate. The smell of greed coming off him was stronger than the smell of the roasted garlic. "What are you saying, Dad?" Emily asked softly. "I am saying that I need to let go." I sighed, acting as if the words were physically painful to speak. "I can't hold on anymore. I want to transfer it all. Not just the trust fund. Everything." I saw Bradley's eyes widen. His pupils dilated. "Everything," he choked out. "The 51% controlling stake in stone architecture I listed, counting on my trembling fingers. The commercial real estate portfolio in Manhattan. The vacation homes in Aspen and Lake Como. I want to sign it all over to you, Bradley. To you and Emily. Clatter. Bradley's fork hit his plate. It slid off onto the tablecloth, leaving a grease stain, but he didn't notice. He was staring at me as if I had just transformed into a giant pile of gold bars. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was doing the mental math. He was realizing that I wasn't just talking about $10 million anymore. I was talking about $500 million. You want me to manage it? Bradley stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. No, I corrected him gently. Not manage. Own. I want to retire. I want to spend my last few months sitting in the garden with Beatrice waiting for the end. You are the man of the house now, Bradley. You are the shark. I saw how you handled the staff. You have the strength I used to have. It was the most disgusting thing I had ever said in my life. I was complimenting the man who beat my wife. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I had to sell this. Bradley stood up. He walked over to my little card table. He didn't look at me with disgust anymore. He looked at me with a terrifying, predatory love. He knelt down beside me, ignoring the fact that his expensive suit pants were touching the floor. He took my hand in his. His palms were sweaty. Dad, he said, his voice dripping with syrup. I don't know what to say. This is a huge responsibility. But you are right. We can't let the board take over. I will protect your legacy. I promise. He squeezed my hand. It took every ounce of my self-control not to pull away. I knew you would, I whispered. You are a good son, Bradley. Emily rushed over, joining the performance. She hugged me from behind, burying her face in my neck. Oh, Daddy, she sniffled. We will take such good care of you. You won't have to worry about a thing. I patted her arm awkwardly. There is just one thing, I said, pulling back slightly. Anything, Bradley said instantly. Anything you want, Dad. I want to do this right, I said, straightening my back just a fraction, allowing a glimmer of my old authority to shine through the cracks of my senility. I don't want to sign these papers in a dark room like a criminal. I am Harrison Stone. When I make a move, the world watches. Bradley nodded eagerly. Of course. Of course. I want you to organize a dinner party, I said. Tomorrow night. Here. I want the board members present. I want the major investors. I want Marcus to bring the full transfer deeds. I want to sign everything over to you in front of everyone so there is no doubt who the new king is. I saw the ego flare up in Bradley's eyes. It was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. He didn't just want the money. He wanted the glory. He wanted the world to see him stepping into my shoes. He wanted to rub it in the faces of the board members who had looked down on him for years. A party, Bradley mused, a grin spreading across his face. A coronation. Yes, I nodded. A coronation. Make it grand, Bradley. Make it the night of your life. I will, he promised, standing up and pacing the room, his energy manic. I will get the caterers. I will call the investors tonight. This is going to be huge. Emily, get my phone. We have work to do. He looked back at me, his eyes shining. You rest, Dad. You just rest. We will handle everything. He rushed out of the room, already dialing a number, shouting orders into the phone. Emily followed him, her earlier fatigue forgotten, energized by the prospect of unlimited wealth. I was left alone in the dining room, or so I thought. I looked up and saw Beatrice standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She had watched the whole thing. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She walked slowly over to my table. She reached out and took my empty broth bowl. For a second, her hand brushed mine. Her skin was warm. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw a spark. It wasn't confusion. It was question. She had heard me give away our life's work to the monster. She wanted to know if I had truly lost my mind. I looked at her. I couldn't speak, not with the security cameras blinking in the corner. But I gave her a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. Beatrice stared at me. Then very slowly, the corner of her mouth twitched. She understood. She took the bowl and walked back to the kitchen, her step a little lighter, her back a little straighter. I sat there in the empty room listening to Bradley in the hallway, bragging to someone on the phone about how he had finally broken the old man. He was inviting the audience to his own execution. He was setting the stage for his own destruction. And he was doing it with a smile on his face. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a moment of pure, cold satisfaction. The bait was taken. The hook was set. Now all I had to do was reel him in. The grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed 2 in the morning. The sound reverberated through the silent house like a funeral toll. I lay on the sofa listening to the heavy silence that followed. Upstairs, Bradley and Emily were sleeping the deep, dreamless sleep of the greedy. They were resting up for their big day. They were dreaming of signatures and bank transfers and the power they thought they would inherit when the sun rose. I was not sleeping. I was counting the seconds. I was calculating angles. I was a structural engineer waiting for the demolition charges to blow. I rose from the sofa, moving with a fluidity that would have terrified my son-in-law if he could see me. My cane remained leaning against the cushions. I did not need it tonight. Tonight, I needed stealth. I moved through the kitchen, the moonlight casting long, pale shadows across the marble floor. I opened the pantry door and slipped into the maintenance shaft, descending once more into the cold darkness of the wine cellar. When I unlocked the heavy door, I expected to find Beatrice asleep or huddled in fear. Instead, she was sitting upright on the cold concrete floor. Her back was straight. Her eyes, though red-rimmed and exhausted, were open and alert. The sugar pills were working. The fog of the scopolamine was lifting, clearing the haze that had shrouded her mind for months. She looked up as I entered, and for the first time there was immediate recognition in her gaze. "Harrison," she whispered. I rushed to her, kneeling on the hard floor. I took her hands in mine. They were cold, but they were steady. She gripped my fingers with a desperate strength. "You came back," she said, her voice trembling not with confusion, but with relief. "I thought I imagined you last night. I thought it was a dream." "It was not a dream, Bea," I said softly, brushing a strand of matted hair from her face. "I am here, and we are almost at the finish line." Her expression suddenly shifted. The relief vanished, replaced by a sharp, piercing terror. She pulled on my hands, trying to drag me toward the door. "You have to go," she hissed, her eyes wide. "You have to leave Harrison. Right now. You don't understand. They are not just mean. They are evil. Bradley. He hits me when I don't sign. He threatens to hurt the grandchildren. He told me he would put me in a home where they tie people to beds." She was shaking now, the trauma of the last few months pouring out of her. "He killed you, Harrison," she sobbed. "He told me you died in Switzerland. He said I was a widow. If he finds you here, if he knows you are sane, he will kill you for real. Please go. Run away and call the police from far away. Don't stay here. You can't win against him. He has taken everything." It broke my heart to see her this way. She was a woman of immense strength, a woman who had raised 3 children and run a charitable foundation, yet she had been reduced to a terrified whisper in a dark basement. She believed the lie. She believed Bradley was an unstoppable monster. "I need to show you something," I said firmly. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen glowed bright blue in the dim cellar. Beatrice flinched at the light, but I held the device steady. "Look," I commanded. "Look at the monster bee." I pressed play. It was the video I had recorded yesterday morning, the one of Bradley pacing in the living room talking on the phone to his broker. The audio was crisp and clear. If this coin launches and dumps, I am dead, Bradley's voice tinny coming from the speaker. I am leveraged up to my eyeballs. Beatrice watched. She listened to the man who had tormented her confessing his own terror. She heard the tremble in his voice. She saw the sweat on his brow. She saw him not as a powerful overlord, but as a frantic, cornered rat. He is not a monster, Beatrice, I said, bringing the phone closer. He is a failure. He is millions of dollars in debt to bad people. He is terrified. Everything he did to you, the chains, the drugs, the lies, it was all because he is weak. He is drowning, and he is trying to stand on your shoulders to keep his head above water. Beatrice stared at the screen long after the video ended. She blinked, processing the shift in reality. The fear in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning anger. She looked up at me, and I saw the spark of the woman I had married return. He is broke, she asked, her voice gaining an edge. He is destitute, I confirmed. And tomorrow I am going to make sure the whole world knows it. I squeezed her hands. I am not running away, Bai. I am going to walk into that party tomorrow, and I am going to burn his world to the ground. But I need you to be strong. I need you to endure this for one more night. Can you do that? She looked down at the chain around her ankle. Then she looked back at me. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a soldier waiting for the signal to charge. Make him pay, Harrison, she whispered. Make him pay for every bruise. I promise, I said. Tomorrow you will be the queen of this house again, and they will be nothing but dust. I kissed her forehead, a promise sealed in the darkness. I had to do the hardest thing then. I had to leave her there. I had to listen to the click of the lock separating us one last time. But as I walked away, I didn't feel the crushing weight of sadness anymore. I felt the cold precision of a surgeon. I did not go back to the sofa. I went to the media room in the East Wing. This was the nerve center of the house's entertainment system, a complex network of servers and cables that controlled every screen and speaker in the estate. Bradley loved this room. He loved to show off the 80-inch screens and the surround sound. He didn't know that I was the one who had drawn the schematics for the wiring. I opened the server cabinet. The hum of the cooling fans filled the small space. I found the main input cable for the living room projection system, the one Bradley would use tomorrow, to display his triumphant graphics and company logos. I pulled my phone out again. I connected it to a small remote access dongle I had prepared with Marcus. I plugged the dongle into the HDMI override port hidden at the back of the rack. It was a simple hack, a Trojan horse. To the system, it looked like a standard diagnostic tool, but the moment I pressed a button on my phone, it would hijack the entire feed. Whatever was on my screen would be on every screen in the house. I pulled up the folder labeled The Truth. Inside were the photos of the forged checks, the medical reports, the videos of the abuse, and the audio recordings of his confession. I queued them up. I set the transition speed. I adjusted the audio levels to maximum volume. I stood there in the blue glow of the server lights, looking at the digital weapon I had just loaded. Marcus had done his part. The legal trap was set in the paperwork. Now the social trap was set in the wires. Bradley wanted a show. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted everyone to look at him. Well, I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. By this time tomorrow, no one would be able to look away. I closed the server cabinet and wiped the handle with my sleeve. I walked back to the living room, moving through the shadows like a ghost. I laid down on the sofa and pulled the blanket up to my chin. I closed my eyes, but my mind was wide awake. I visualized the party. I visualized the guests. I visualized the moment the music would stop and the screens would flicker. It was going to be a masterpiece. It was going to be the greatest project of my career. The demolition of a tyrant broadcast in high definition. I smiled in the darkness. Let the storm come. I was the lightning. The transformation of my home was complete by 7 o'clock that evening. The driveway, usually a place of quiet dignity lined with the Japanese maples I had planted myself, was now a parking lot for the ostentatious. A parade of Lamborghinis, Bentleys, and limousines clogged the pavers, their engines idling with a deep, arrogant rumble. I sat in my rented wheelchair in the corner of the ballroom, a blanket tucked securely over my knees, watching the invasion. These were not friends. These were sharks. I recognized them all. There were the hedge fund managers who had tried to short my company's stock in 2008. There were the real estate developers who cut corners on safety to save a nickel. And there were the desperate ones, the men Bradley owed money to, dressed in ill-fitting suits, their eyes scanning the room, not for beauty, but for liquidity. The air in the room grew thick with the scent of expensive perfume and heavy cologne masking the underlying rot of the occasion. Waiters hired from a high-end agency moved through the crowd with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, but they were not the only ones serving. Bradley had insisted on one final public humiliation. Beatrice was moving through the crowd holding a tray of champagne flutes. He had allowed her a clean uniform for the occasion, a crisp black dress with a white apron, the kind a servant would wear in a period drama. It was a costume designed to strip her of her identity, to reduce the matriarch of this estate to a piece of background scenery. I watched a woman in a red dress take a glass from Beatrice, without even looking at her face, treating my wife with less regard than she would a vending machine. Beatrice did not flinch. She kept her back straight, her movements measured. The guests saw a servant, but I saw a queen in exile. She caught my eye across the room. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She was ready. She was enduring this one last indignity because she knew what was coming. Marcus stood near the bar nursing a club soda. He looked like just another bored lawyer, but his eyes were sharp, tracking Bradley's every move. He tapped his chest pocket twice, signaling that the papers were ready. Oof. The real transfer documents and the poison pill that would destroy Bradley's life were resting against his heart. I shifted in my wheelchair, my hand slipping into the pocket of my cardigan. My thumb rested on the small, smooth plastic of the remote control. It was warm to the touch. I traced the contours of the trigger button, feeling the potential energy stored within it. It was such a small thing, a piece of plastic and a battery, yet it held the power to shatter the illusion Bradley had spent years constructing. The music lowered. The lights dimmed, casting the room into a dramatic twilight, leaving a single spotlight focused on the small stage Bradley had erected in front of the marble fireplace. A hush fell over the crowd. They turned their faces toward the light, like moths drawn to a flame, waiting for the performance to begin. Bradley stepped into the spotlight. He looked every inch the young tycoon. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, hugging his frame. His hair was slicked back. He held a crystal glass of whiskey in one hand, swirling the amber liquid with a practiced ease. He didn't look like a man who was millions of dollars in debt. He looked like a man who owned the world. Emily stood just outside the circle of light, watching him with a look of adoration that made my stomach turn. She was complicit in every lie, every bruise, every stolen dollar. "Welcome, everyone," Bradley began, his voice booming with a practiced baritone that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I had designed to carry the sound of laughter, not lies. "Thank you for joining us on this historic night." A ripple of polite applause moved through the room. Bradley smiled, soaking it in. He took a sip of his drink, pacing the stage with the confidence of a predator who believes the jungle has no lions left. "Tonight isn't just about business," he continued, his tone shifting to one of solemn reverence. "It is about legacy. We all know the great Harrison Stone, the Iron Architect, the man who built this city." He gestured vaguely toward my corner. The spotlight swung over to me for a brief, blinding second. I blinked, letting my mouth hang open slightly, putting on the mask of the confused invalid. The crowd murmured. I heard whispers of "poor thing" and "so sad." They looked at me and saw a relic. they saw a crumbling statue. They didn't see the demolition expert sitting inside the ruins. The light swung back to Bradley. "It breaks my heart to see him like this," Bradley said, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. "But time waits for no man. And as the sun sets on his era, it must rise on a new one. Harrison has entrusted me with a sacred duty. He has asked me to take the helm, to guide his ship through the storms of the future." He paused for effect. The room was silent. The investors were leaning in, their eyes gleaming with greed. They were calculating their returns. They were already spending the money they thought Bradley was about to unlock. "People ask me," Bradley said, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded total attention. "They ask me, Bradley, how do you do it? How do you manage a fortune and a family? How do you care for a sick man and a confused woman while running an empire?" He looked out at the crowd, his face a mask of humble martyrdom. "And I tell them it is easy when you have love," he declared, raising his glass higher. "Love is the foundation of this house. It is the mortar that holds these bricks together. I don't see Harrison and Beatrice as burdens. I don't see them as in-laws." My thumb tightened on the remote. The plastic dug into my skin. This was it. He was walking right into the crosshairs. "I treat my wife's parents." Bradley shouted, his voice soaring with fake passion, exactly like they were my own flesh and blood. "I treat them with the dignity, the respect, and the care that they deserve." Click. I pressed the button. The connection was instantaneous. I didn't need to see the server room to know that the Trojan horse had just kicked down the gates. The massive projection screen behind Bradley, which was displaying a looping logo of stone architecture, suddenly went black. The music cut out with a sharp screech of feedback that made several guests cover their ears. Bradley froze. He looked back at the screen, confused. "Technical difficulties, folks." He laughed nervously, tapping his microphone. Just a moment. But the screen didn't stay black. It flickered. A wall of static roared through the high-fidelity speakers, a harsh grinding noise that silenced the room completely. And then the image resolved. It wasn't a logo. It wasn't a graph. It was a video file time-stamped 3 days ago. The image was grainy, taken from a hidden camera, but the clarity was undeniable. It showed the kitchen. It showed Bradley standing over Beatrice. It showed the back of his hand connecting with her face. The sound of the slap echoed through the ballroom, amplified by the concert-quality speakers. It was a thunderclap of violence that shattered the polite atmosphere of the party instantly. On screen, Bradley was screaming, "You useless old hag! Look at this! This is silk!" In the ballroom, the real Bradley stood paralyzed on stage. His glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered the sound, perfectly synchronizing with the violence on the screen. He stared up at his own crime, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. The guests gasped, a collective sound of shock that sucked the air out of the room. But I wasn't done. I pressed the button again. Next slide. The image on the screen shifted with a brutal digital stutter. The slap was gone, replaced by a scene that was even more harrowing because of its silence. It was the wine cellar. The timestamp in the corner read 2 weeks ago. The camera angle hidden behind the wine rack looked down on my wife, huddled in the corner. Bradley was there, towering over her. On the screen, he was shouting, though the audio was muffled. Beatrice was crying, shaking her head, refusing to sign the document in his hand. And then the monster moved. He didn't use his hand this time. He drew back his leg, the one shod in the Italian leather I had paid for, and he delivered a vicious kick to her ribs. The impact was captured perfectly by the high-sensitivity microphone I had installed. A sickening, dull thud echoed through the ballroom, louder than the gasp that tore through the crowd. On the massive screen, Beatrice crumbled, clutching her side, curling into a ball of agony. The video froze on that frame, a high-definition portrait of domestic cruelty that loomed over the real Bradley like a judgment from God. In the ballroom, the silence was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking the oxygen out of the room. The investors who moments ago had been calculating their profits now looked at Bradley as if he were radioactive. The socialites in their diamonds covered their mouths, their eyes darting from the frozen image of the beaten woman to the man standing on the stage. Bradley was no longer the charismatic heir. He was a statue of terror. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tuxedo. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The lies he had prepared, the speeches about love and dignity, died in his throat. I pressed the button again. The screen flickered. The cellar vanished. Now we were in the kitchen. It was bright, cheerful, the morning sun streaming across the marble island. Emily was there. My daughter. My little girl. She was humming a tune as she prepared a bowl of soup. She looked like the perfect housewife. But then she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the amber bottle. She opened a blue capsule and poured the white powder into the steaming broth. She stirred it in a small, tight smile playing on her lips. The audio kicked in. It was crystal clear. "Drink up, Mom!" Emily's voice chirped from the speakers, sweet and poisonous. "This will help you sleep. And maybe this time you will stay asleep so we can get some work done." A woman in the front row let out a strangled sob. It was Mrs. Vanderwall, a grandmother herself. She looked at Emily with a mixture of horror and betrayal that could flay skin. Emily, who had been standing in the shadows, let out a shriek. It wasn't a scream of remorse. It was the scream of a cornered animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. "Turn it off!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Turn it off! It is fake! It is deep fake!" But I wasn't done. I had one more nail for the coffin. I pressed the button a third time. The screen went black, but the speakers came alive. It was the recording from the living room, the one I had taken just yesterday. "I don't care about the old man," Bradley's voice boomed, magnified to godlike proportions. "He is a vegetable. As soon as he kicks the bucket, I am buying the yacht. I already picked out the name. The inheritance. Pretty funny, right? Let him rot in his diapers. I just need the signature, and he can drop dead for all I care." The laughter that followed on the recording was heinous, a wet, self-satisfied chuckle that peeled back the skin of his charm and revealed the maggot underneath. That was the breaking point. The glass of whiskey Bradley had been holding slipped from his numb fingers. It hit the marble stage with a shatter that sounded like a gunshot. The sound broke the trance. The crowd erupted. It wasn't applause this time. It was a low, angry rumble that grew into a roar of outrage. Men were standing up, their faces dark with fury. The facade was gone. The monster was naked. Emily saw her life crumbling. She saw the country club memberships, the spa days, the social standing, all of it turning to ash. Panic overrode her reason. She saw the projector sitting on a table near the back, beaming the evidence onto the wall. She lunged. She ran across the ballroom floor, her heels clicking frantically, her face twisted into a mask of pure malice. She was heading for the power cord. She thought if she could just kill the image, she could kill the truth. She was running right past me. She didn't look at me. To her, I was still the cripple in the wheelchair, the helpless observer. She didn't see the man who had built this floor. She didn't see the father who had carried her when she scraped her knee and who was now ready to discipline her for scraping her mother's soul. As she sprinted past, I didn't shout. I didn't stand up. I simply moved my right arm. I extended my heavy hickory cane, positioning it precisely in the path of her flying ankles. It was a simple geometric calculation. Velocity times obstacle equals consequence. Emily's shin connected with the wood. She didn't even have time to scream. Her feet stopped, but her momentum didn't. She went airborne. For a split second, she was flying a silk-clad missile of desperation. Then gravity claimed her. She hit the floor hard, skidding across the polished parquet, crashing into a table of hors d'oeuvres. Silver platters clattered. Shrimp and cocktail sauce flew into the air. She landed in a heap of ruin, a physical manifestation of her fallen status. The room went silent again, all eyes turning to the source of the intervention. They turned to the wheelchair. They turned to the old man. I slowly lowered the cane. I sat up straighter. I reached up and unbuttoned the collar of my cardigan, throwing off the blanket that had covered my legs. I placed my hands on the armrests of the wheelchair and pushed. A gasp went through the crowd, louder this time. Harrison, someone whispered. I stood up. I didn't tremble. I didn't shake. I stood to my full height, towering over the room, the iron architect returning from the dead. I adjusted my cuffs. I looked down at Emily, who was groaning on the floor, covered in food and disgrace. Then I looked up at Bradley, who was trembling on the stage, shrinking under the weight of 100 accusing eyes. I picked up my cane not to lean on it, but to hold it like a scepter. I took one step forward. My footfall was heavy, solid, authoritative. You wanted a show, Bradley, as I said, my voice clear and strong, projecting without a microphone to the back of the room. You wanted everyone to witness the transfer of power. Well, here it is. I began to walk toward the stage. The crowd parted from me like the Red Sea. They stepped back with respect, with fear, with awe. I walked past the shocked investors. I walked past the crying socialites. I walked toward the man who had tried to bury me, and with every step I shoveled the dirt back onto his grave. I am not dead yet, son, I said, reaching the steps of the stage. And I am definitely not signing anything. Bradley took a step back, tripping over his own feet. He looked at me as if I were a vengeful ghost. Dad, he squeaked. Dad, please. I can explain. It was a joke. It was all a joke. I climbed the stairs. I stood face to face with him. I smelled the fear on him. It smelled like victory. The punchline is coming, Bradley, I said coldly. And you are not going to like it. I climbed the final step onto the stage, and the wood groaned under my boots. It was the only sound in the entire ballroom. 500 people were holding their breath, their eyes locked on the impossible sight of the invalid walking. I stood before the podium, towering over the man who had spent the last 6 months shrinking my world down to the size of a pill bottle. Bradley tried to back away, his heels clicking nervously against the floor, but he bumped into the heavy marble lectern. There was nowhere left to run. The stage he had built for his glory was now his scaffold. I reached out and took the microphone from his trembling hand. He didn't fight me for it. He surrendered it like a child caught stealing from the collection plate. His fingers were cold and wet with sweat. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the fog of drugs or the pretense of frailty. He wasn't a monster. Monsters have power. He was just a small, greedy boy playing dress-up in a man's tuxedo. I turned to the crowd. I saw the shock on the faces of the board members. I saw the horror in the eyes of the investors. They were waiting for an explanation. They were waiting for the punchline. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice didn't waver. It didn't crack with age. It boomed through the high-fidelity speakers with the resonance of the man who had laid the foundation of this very building. You all came here tonight to witness a transfer of legacy, I said, my eyes sweeping across the room before locking back onto Bradley. You came to see the torch being passed. I took a step closer to him, invading his personal space, forcing him to look up at me. You stood here and gave a speech about family, Bradley. You spoke about burden. You spoke about love. You wrapped yourself in my name like it was a shield. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a growl that vibrated through the floorboards. But you forgot one thing. You thought my legacy was the money in the bank. You thought it was the buildings in the skyline. You were wrong. My legacy is integrity and honor. Those are the currencies I trade in. And you, Bradley, you are bankrupt in both. Bradley opened his mouth to speak to spin another lie, but I cut him off. "You don't have the spine to carry my name," I declared. "You don't even have the spine to look your wife in the eye after you poisoned her mother." I pointed to the back of the room. The double doors swung open with a heavy, ominous thud. Marcus walked in, his face set in grim determination. Flanking him were 2 uniformed police officers and 3 men in sharp charcoal suits carrying thick briefcases, the forensic auditors. The sight of them hit Bradley harder than a physical blow. He knew who those men in gray suits were. They were the reapers of the financial world. I turned back to the audience, addressing the stunned board members in the front row. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I apologize for the theatrical nature of this evening. But as chairman of Stone Architecture, I have an administrative duty to perform, and I believe in transparency." I looked down at Bradley. He was shaking his head, tears streaming down his face, silently mouthing the word "no" over and over again. "Bradley," I said, my voice ringing out like a gavel strike, "for the crimes of embezzlement, corporate fraud, forgery of executive documents, and gross misconduct, you are hereby terminated, effective immediately." The word "terminated" hung in the air. "Your security clearance is revoked." I continued listing his demise with clinical precision. "Your access to company accounts has been frozen as of 10 minutes ago. Your corporate cards have been canceled. You are no longer the acting CEO. You are a trespasser." Bradley grabbed my arm, his grip desperate and weak. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice a pathetic squeak. "The investors. Don't do this in front of them. We can fix this. I can pay it back." I pulled my arm away as if I had been touched by something contagious. "Pay it back?" I asked, loud enough for the loan sharks in the back to hear. "With what money, Bradley?" "You don't have any money. You spent the company's reserves on gambling. You mortgaged this house to pay your debts. And the $10 million you thought you were getting tonight?" I smiled, a cold, shark-like smile. "It was never real. The transfer documents you saw were conditional. And since you are currently under investigation for felony fraud, the condition is void. You are broke, Bradley. You are destitute." Marcus stepped onto the stage, followed closely by the police. He handed a document to the lead officer. Officer Marcus said, his voice calm and professional. "This is the confession obtained from the suspect's own recordings, along with the forensic accounting logs proving the theft of $2 million. And this," he held up a second document, "this is a court order for immediate asset seizure granted by the emergency judge an hour ago." I looked at Bradley. "As the primary creditor of the funds you stole, I am exercising my right to immediate restitution. The Jaguar in the driveway. That is mine now. The watch on your wrist. Mine. The custom tuxedo on your back. That was bought with my money." I leaned in one last time. "You entered this family with nothing but a smile and a lie. You will leave it with handcuffs and a criminal record." The officers stepped forward. Bradley tried to run. It was a pathetic, instinctive lunge toward the side exit, but his legs gave out. He stumbled, grasping at the air. The officers were on him in a second. They hauled him up, twisting his arms behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was sharp and metallic. Click, click, click. It was the sweetest sound I had heard in years. It was the sound of the chain around Beatrice's ankle being transferred to the wrists of her abuser. Bradley screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was the scream of a narcissist whose mirror had finally shattered. "Mike, Dave," he yelled, looking wildly at the investors he had been drinking with minutes ago. "Help me tell them it is a misunderstanding. I am the CEO." But the room was silent. The investors turned their backs. They looked at their shoes. They looked at their phones. No one wanted to be associated with a corpse. Bradley was radioactive. He was being dragged across the stage, his feet dragging on the marble, stripping him of the last shred of dignity he possessed. I watched him go. I watched the police haul him down the stairs, past the woman in the red dress, past the table where Emily was still sobbing into a pile of shrimp, past the stunned waiters. As they reached the doors, Bradley looked back at me one last time. His eyes were wide with terror and confusion. He still didn't understand. He thought he was playing a game of checkers, and he had just realized I had been playing chess with live ammunition. "Get him out of my sight," I commanded. The doors closed behind him, cutting off his wails. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, but it was clean. The air felt lighter. The smell of his cologne was fading, replaced by the scent of justice. I stood there on the stage, the cane in one hand, the microphone in the other. My heart was pounding not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the kill. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. The Iron Architect was back, and the renovation of my life had just begun with the demolition of the rot. The police sirens faded into the night, taking the chaos with them, but the silence they left behind was heavy. The ballroom was empty now, save for the cleaning staff who moved quietly, sweeping up the shattered glass and the ruins of the party. And there was Emily. My daughter sat on the edge of the stage, her expensive dress stained with cocktail sauce, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. She looked like a child waiting for her parents to pick her up from school, but no one was coming. Her husband was in a holding cell. Her friends had fled, and her father was standing over her, holding a piece of paper that would define her future. She looked up at me, her eyes swollen. She tried to smile, a pathetic, wavering attempt to rekindle the charm she had used to manipulate me for years. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. You have to believe me. Bradley forced me. I was scared of him too. I am a victim here." I looked at her. I looked for the little girl I had raised, the one I had taught to ride a pony, the one I had read bedtime stories to. But I couldn't find her. All I saw was the woman who had poured poison into her mother's soup. All I saw was the woman who had watched her husband kick a defenseless old lady and turned up the volume on the TV to drown out the whimpers. "Stop," I said. The word was soft, but it hit her like a wall. "Don't insult my intelligence, Emily. I saw the videos. I heard your voice. You weren't a victim. You were an accomplice. You enjoyed the cruelty because you thought it bought you a lifestyle." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the check I had written earlier that morning. I held it out to her. She reached for his with shaking hands, hope flaring in her eyes. She probably thought it was a lifeline. She probably thought it was enough to cover a lawyer, or a hotel, or a new start in a penthouse. She looked at the amount. $1,000, she gasped, looking up at me in disbelief. "Daddy, this won't even cover a night at the Ritz. What am I supposed to do with this?" I looked at her coldly. "That is enough to rent a small room in a boarding house for a month," I said. "It is enough to buy a cheap suit for a job interview. And it is enough to buy some food. It is more than you gave your mother when you made her sleep on a mat." "But I have nowhere to go," she wailed, clutching the check. "You can't throw me out. I am your daughter." I walked past her to the front door. I opened it wide, revealing the dark, empty driveway. The cold night air rushed in. "You ceased to be my daughter the moment you decided my wife was disposable," I said. "You are a stranger to me now. A stranger who owes me a great deal of money, but I am willing to write that off as the cost of a lesson learned." I pointed to the darkness. "Go, Emily. Go out there and find out who you are when you don't have my name to hide behind. Learn what it means to earn $1 instead of stealing it." She stood up sobbing, realizing that the well had truly run dry. She walked past me, stepping over the threshold. She stood on the exact spot where I had found Beatrice lying in the dirt just 2 days ago. The poetic justice was not lost on me. "Goodbye, Emily," I said. I didn't wait for her to answer. I closed the heavy oak door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the final period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I locked it. I turned around and saw Beatrice standing at the top of the stairs. She was wearing her old silk robe, the one she loved. She looked tired, but she was standing tall. She smiled at me. And in that empty, quiet house, I finally felt at home. The days that followed were not filled with celebration, but with a necessary grim sanitization. We didn't just clean the house, we exorcised it. The next morning, I hired a crew of movers. I didn't tell them to be careful. I told them to empty the West Wing entirely. Bradley's glass desk, his ergonomic chair, the ridiculous portraits of himself shaking hands with politicians he had probably bribed, all of it was hauled out to a dumpster in the service alley. I watched from the window as the physical remnants of his ego were crushed by the compactor. It was a violent sound, crunching metal and shattering glass, and it was music to my ears. But the physical cleaning was the easy part. The legal cleaning was where the true battle lay. Marcus practically moved in for a week. We set up a war room in my reclaimed study. We went through every account, every trust, every subsidiary. Bradley had been like a termite. He had burrowed deep, eating away at the foundations of my empire. But he was sloppy. Arrogance always makes a man sloppy. We found the offshore accounts he hadn't had time to scrub. We found the transfers to the crypto wallets. We recovered nearly 70% of the liquid assets he had tried to siphon off before the coronation. The rest, I wrote it off. It was the price of admission to get my life back. The hardest part, however, wasn't the money. It was the withdrawal. Beatrice had been on those blue pills for months. The sugar placebo I had swapped in had started the process, but the chemical dependency was real. For 3 nights, she shook, she sweat. She cried out in her sleep, terrified that she was back in the cellar, terrified that she had forgotten to scrub a spot on the floor. I sat by her bedside every hour of every night. I held her hand. I wiped her brow with cool cloths. I reintroduced her to herself. "You are Beatrice Stone," I would whisper to her when the panic set in. "You are the toughest woman I know. You survived them. You won." By the 4th day, the fever broke. She sat up, drank a cup of tea, and looked out the window at the Japanese maples. "Harrison," she said, her voice steady for the first time. "Burn the mattress." "Which one?" "The guest room mattress. The one they made me sleep on before the cellar. Burn it. I never want to see it again." We did it in the backyard in the old stone fire pit. We threw in the mattress. We threw in the gray maid's dress. We threw in the blue pills I had confiscated from the safe. As the smoke rose into the twilight, carrying away the stench of our oppression, I felt the last knot in my chest loosen. But the devil always tries to knock one last time. It happened a week later. The intercom at the gate buzzed. It was Emily. She wasn't alone. "Dad, please." Her voice crackled over the speaker, distorted by static, but heavy with manipulation. "I have the kids in the car. They want to see their grandfather. They miss you. You can't punish them for this." I stared at the monitor. I could see her car. I could see the silhouette of my grandchildren in the back seat. It was a low blow. It was the lowest blow. She was using innocent children as human shields, trying to pry open the gates of the fortress I had just secured. My hand hovered over the open button. The biological pull was immense. Those were my grandkids. I wanted to hold them. I wanted to spoil them. But then I looked at Beatrice. She was standing by the window watching the monitor. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She was shaking her head slowly. "If you let her in," Beatrice said softly, "she will never leave. She will use those children like battering rams. She will teach them to hate us if we don't pay her. She will poison them just like she poisoned me." She was right. Emily didn't bring them here for love. She brought them here for leverage. I pressed the talk button. "Go home, Emily," I said. "But Dad, the boys, they are crying." "Then comfort them," I replied, my voice hard as granite. Be a mother. For the first time in your life, stop looking for a payout and just be a mother. If you need money for food, call Marcus. He has a setup for the children's necessities, direct payments to schools and doctors. Not a penny goes to you. Not a penny goes to Bradley's defense fund. Goodbye. I severed the connection. I watched on the screen as she screamed at the camera, pounding the steering wheel. Then finally she reversed the car and drove away. It was the most painful thing I had ever done, denying my own blood. But a gangrenous limb must be cut, or the infection spreads to the heart. We had cut the limb, now we could heal. We need to leave, Beatrice said, turning away from the window. This house, it is ours again, but it ghosts. I see him in the dining room. I see her in the kitchen. I need son Harrison. I need to be somewhere where the air doesn't taste like betrayal. Where do you want to go? I asked. Italy, she said instantly. The Amalfi Coast. Remember the villa we rented in '95, the one with the lemon trees? I remember. Take me there. Let's spend the rest of our money on pasta and wine and sunsets. Let's spend it on us. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had felt on my face in 6 months. Pack your bags, Mrs. Stone, I said. We are going on vacation. 6 months later. The sun over the Amalfi Coast is different from the sun in the Hamptons. It is warmer, kinder. It smells of lemons and salt water. I sit on the terrace of a small villa Beatrice and I rented for the summer. The view is spectacular, a canvas of deep blues and greens, but I am not looking at the ocean. I am looking at my wife. Beatrice is sitting at the table laughing. She is playing cards with a group of locals we met in the village. Her hands are steady as she deals the deck. Her eyes are bright and clear. The shadows of the cellar are gone, burned away by the Italian sun, and the peace of a life reclaimed. She looks up and catches me watching her. She blows me a kiss. I take a sip of my espresso. My phone buzzes on the table. It is an email from Marcus. Bradley pleaded guilty, the message reads. 15 years. No parole. Emily is working as a waitress in New Jersey. She hasn't tried to contact us. I delete the email. I don't need updates on the past. I am too busy living in the present. I have learned that family is not defined by whose blood runs in your veins. It is defined by who stands beside you when the world is burning. It is defined by respect, by kindness, by the gentle act of caring for one another. Bradley and Emily shared our DNA, but they were strangers to our hearts. They saw us as resources, not as people. And you can never build a home with someone who sees you as a brick to be used. Do not be afraid to prune the branches of your family tree if they are rotten. It hurts. It leaves a scar. But sometimes you have to cut off the dead weight so the rest of the tree can survive. We did. And now we are blooming. Throughout this ordeal, I realized that the greatest betrayal often comes disguised as love. The people who claim to care for you the most are sometimes the ones sharpening the knife. It is a hard truth to swallow, especially when it involves your own children. But blind loyalty to toxic family members is not a virtue. It is a form of self-destruction. You have the right to protect your peace. You have the right to say no. You have the right to demand respect regardless of titles or shared history. We often tolerate abuse from family that we would never accept from a stranger, simply because we are afraid of breaking the bond. But a bond that strangles you is not a lifeline. It is a noose. Walking away wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of survival. And standing here today, watching my wife smile, I know it was the bravest thing I ever did. If you have ever had to make the difficult choice to cut ties with toxic family members, or if you are currently struggling with a situation where you feel used and undervalued, I want you to know you are not alone. Please hit the like button and share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be the encouragement someone else needs to finally stand up for themselves. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and resilience. Until next time, remember that your dignity is priceless and never let anyone sell it for cheap.